Meryl Streep sat quietly by the window in the first-class cabin, her elegant fingers turning the pages of a well-worn script, completely unaware that in just a few hours she would forever change the life of the woman now boarding, a woman whose sharp tongue and sharper judgment would crumble in the face of unexpected turbulence and unwelcome truth. The gentle hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop as the luxury cabin of the transatlantic flight settled into its rhythm. Soft lighting illuminated the plush leather seats, while flight attendants moved with practiced grace, ensuring each passenger's comfort before the long journey ahead. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Meryl wore a simple cream blouse and tailored grey pants, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, silver hair swept, back in a casual style that spoke of comfort rather than pretension. At 73, she carried the gravitas of her decades-long career with the same effortless authenticity that had made her the most acclaimed actress of her generation. Yet nothing in her demeanor demanded acknowledgement of this fact. She was simply another traveler on the London to New York flight, content in her quiet corner of the world. The serenity of the moment was interrupted by the distinct click of stiletto heels against the aisle floor. Jessica Harlow strode into the first-class cabin with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding every room she entered. As one of New York's most influential literary agents, she had built her reputation on a razor-sharp instinct for bestsellers and an even sharper ability to cut down anyone who stood in her way. Jessica's crimson blazer and perfectly coiffed dark hair contrasted sharply with Meryl's understated elegance. Diamond earrings caught the cabin light as she settled into her seat directly across the aisle from Meryl, not sparing the older woman a glance as she arranged her designer handbag and immediately signaled for a flight attendant. "Champagne, please." "Your finest," Jessica instructed, her tone making it clear this was an expectation rather than a request. She glanced at her watch, a gleaming Cartier piece that cost more than many people's monthly salary, and frowned slightly. "And could you ensure we take off on schedule? I have an important meeting in New York tomorrow morning." The young flight attendant, whose name tag read Emily, smiled politely. "I'll bring your champagne right away, Ms. Harlow. As for the departure time, we're currently on schedule, but ultimately that's up to air traffic control." Jessica waved her hand dismissively and turned her attention to her phone, firing off final emails before the required shutdown for takeoff. It was only then, in the brief pause between messages, that she finally noticed Meryl sitting across from her. Her gaze flickered over the older woman, taking in the simple clothing, the absence of visible luxury brands, and the well-used script rather than a tablet or laptop. A slight frown creased Jessica's perfectly made-up face. In her worldview, first, class was a domain for the elite, for people like her who had earned their place through ambition and success. This unassuming woman with her reading glasses and paperwork seemed oddly out of place among the business executives and wealthy travelers who typically populated these exclusive seats. When Emily returned with the champagne, Jessica leaned forward, slightly lowering her voice but not enough to prevent being overheard. "Excuse me, but I believe there may have been some mistake with the seating arrangements," she said, gesturing subtly toward Meryl without looking directly at her. Emily's eyes widened slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. "I'm sorry, Ms. Harlow, but I don't understand. All of our first-class passengers are correctly seated." Jessica let out a small, impatient sigh. "I mean, are you certain that everyone here actually belongs in first class?" Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Meryl, who continued reading her script. Though the slight pause in her page-turning suggested she was listening, Emily's professional smile faltered. "I can assure you, Ms. Harlow, that all passengers in this cabin have valid first-class tickets," she replied, her voice taking on a slight edge despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I see," Jessica said, though her tone suggested she remained unconvinced. She took a deliberate sip of her champagne, letting the matter drop but making her disapproval clear. Meryl turned a page in her script, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had encountered countless Jessicas throughout her life, people so wrapped up in status and appearances that they missed the humanity right in front of them. After decades in the public eye, she had developed an almost invisible armor against judgment, particularly from those who failed to recognize her without the context of red carpets and camera flashes. Several other passengers had noticed some exchanging knowing glances. A silver-haired businessman across the aisle suppressed a smile, while a younger woman a few rows ahead kept stealing glances back at Meryl, excitement dancing in her eyes at recognizing the legendary actress. Jessica remained oblivious to the silent ripple of recognition moving through the cabin. She returned to her phone, firing off one last email before the announcement to prepare for takeoff forced her to stow it away. As the plane began to taxi, she reclined slightly in her seat, satisfied with her position in the world, unaware that the next few hours would shake the very foundations upon which she had built her identity. Meryl closed her script as the aircraft accelerated down the runway, gazing out at the rapidly disappearing ground below. In the reflection of the window, she could see Jessica arranging her space with meticulous precision, a woman who believed she controlled not just her destiny, but the very air around her. Meryl had played enough characters to recognize the storyline. Unfolding beside her, a tale of pride, misjudgment, and perhaps, if the universe was kind, redemption. Little did either woman know that 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, their carefully constructed worlds were about to collide in ways neither could anticipate. The plane reached cruising altitude, the gentle ping of the seatbelt sign turning off signaling passengers they were free to move about the cabin. Jessica Harlow immediately reclined her seat to the perfect angle, not too flat to wrinkle her Armani blazer, but just enough to establish dominance over her allotted space. She had mastered the art of occupying the world precisely as she believed she deserved to. Jessica reached for her champagne, taking a calculated sip while observing the cabin with a practiced eye. In her 15 years as a literary agent, she had developed an almost predatory ability to assess people at a glance: who mattered, who didn't, who could be useful, who was merely taking up space. It was this very skill that had propelled her from an assistant's desk to the corner office at Harlow Literary Management, her own boutique agency that represented some of publishing's most lucrative authors. "Would you like anything else, Ms. Harlow?" Emily, the flight attendant, had returned, her professional smile firmly in place despite their earlier interaction. "Sparkling water with lime, no ice," Jessica replied, without looking up from the manuscript she had pulled from her leather portfolio. "And please ensure I'm not disturbed for the next hour. I have important work to review." Across the aisle, Meryl had set aside her script and was now engaged in conversation with another flight attendant, her expression warm and attentive as the young man spoke animatedly about something Jessica couldn't hear. Whatever he said made Meryl laugh, a genuine sound that drew the attention of nearby passengers. Jessica frowned slightly. The woman's ease with the staff irritated her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. In Jessica's world, service personnel existed in the periphery, necessary but ultimately invisible unless they failed to meet expectations. This woman, with her shabby script and off-the-rack clothing, treated the flight attendant as though they were sharing coffee at a friend's kitchen table. "Some people simply don't understand appropriate boundaries," Jessica muttered under her breath, returning to her manuscript with renewed focus. The truth was, Jessica had built her entire life around maintaining those very boundaries. Daughter of middle-class teachers from Connecticut, she had meticulously constructed her identity brick by brick. The right schools, the right clothes, the right connections. She had studied how the elite spoke, how they moved, how they dismissed. She had practiced her cutting remarks in mirrors until they came as naturally as breathing. Her ascent had been calculated and relentless, fueled by an unyielding belief. That respect was commanded, never earned. Emily returned with Jessica's sparkling water. "Here you are, Ms. Harlow. We'll be serving dinner in about 45 minutes. "I'll have the salmon, not the chicken," Jessica replied, without looking up. "And please decant the wine properly this time. Last flight it was served entirely too cold." "Of course," Emily said, though her smile had grown slightly more fixed. As she walked away, Jessica couldn't help but notice how she paused at Meryl's seat, leaning down to say something that made the older woman nod appreciatively. For the next half-hour, Jessica attempted to focus on the manuscript, a promising thriller from a debut author. but found her attention repeatedly drawn to the woman across the aisle. There was something unsettling about her calm self-possession, the way she seemed perfectly content to exist without broadcasting her importance to everyone around her. When dinner service began, Jessica observed as the flight attendants approached. Meryl first, a small courtesy that didn't go unnoticed. The older woman accepted her meal with genuine thanks, engaging briefly with each crew member as though their interaction was the highlight of her day. "Excuse me," Jessica finally said, unable to contain herself any longer. She directed her question to Meryl, who looked up with mild surprise. "I couldn't help but notice the crew seems particularly attentive to you. Do you fly this route often?" Meryl's blue eyes crinkled slightly at the corners as she smiled. "Occasionally, though I think they're lovely to everyone." Jessica's lips thinned. The woman's voice was melodious, cultured, not what she had expected. "Well, first class certainly isn't what it used to be," she said, glancing meaningfully at Meryl's simple attire. "There was a time when there were certain standards." Few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A silver-haired man 2 rows ahead turned slightly, his expression disapproving, but Jessica didn't notice, focused as she was on making her point. Meryl tilted her head slightly, studying Jessica with the same careful attention she might give to a complicated character in a script. "And what standards would those be?" she asked, her tone gentle but somehow not yielding an inch. "Presentation, accomplishment, a certain level of success," Jessica replied, gesturing vaguely to encompass her designer clothes, her manicured nails, her aura of importance. "First class is meant to be exclusive for a reason." "I see," Meryl said, nodding thoughtfully. "And you believe you can determine someone's level of accomplishment by looking at them?" Jessica took a deliberate sip of her wine. "I've been in this business long enough to read people quite accurately. It's a necessary skill in my position." "And what position is that?" Meryl asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I'm the founder and president of Harlow Literary Management," Jessica said, the practiced smoothness of her voice revealing how often she had made this introduction. "Perhaps you've heard of us? We represent James Patterson, among others." "How fascinating," Meryl replied. "I've always found the publishing world intriguing, all those stories waiting to be told." Something in the woman's tone made Jessica feel as though she was being humored rather than impressed, and it needled her in a spot she thought long calloused over. "Yes, well, it's quite competitive. Only the exceptional survive." She adjusted her blazer slightly. "And what is it that you do?" A young woman seated nearby nearly choked on her water, quickly covering her mouth with a napkin. The businessman who had turned earlier now seemed to be suppressing laughter. Meryl's smile remained unchanged. "I'm in the arts," she said simply. "I tell stories too in my way." "Ah," Jessica said, not bothering to hide her dismissal. "Community theatre, how nice for you." Before Meryl could respond, turbulence rocked the plane, causing the overhead bins to rattle ominously. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're heading into some unexpected rough air. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts as a precaution." Jessica gripped her armrests, her knuckles whitening as the plane shuddered again. She glanced at Meryl, expecting to see her similarly distressed, but the older woman calmly secured her tray table and fastened her seatbelt, her expression serene despite the increasing violence of the turbulence. As the plane dropped suddenly, eliciting gasps throughout the cabin, Jessica felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. Across the aisle, Meryl remained steady, a fixed point in a suddenly chaotic world, and for the first time since boarding, Jessica found herself looking at the older woman, not with disdain, but with a growing seed of doubt. The aircraft lurched, violently to the right, causing several drinks to spill and a chorus of gasps to ripple through the cabin. Jessica's half-full wine glass toppled, splashing crimson liquid across her pristine white tablet case. She let out a small cry of dismay, frantically dabbing at the spreading stain with a napkin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, strained but professional. "We've encountered an unexpected weather system. We'll be experiencing significant turbulence for the next 20 to 30 minutes. All cabin crew, please suspend service and secure the cabin. Jessica's heart hammered against her ribs as the plane shuddered again. She had flown hundreds of times, had practically lived in first-class cabins while building her agency, but something about this turbulence felt different, more threatening, more unpredictable. She glanced at the window, but there was nothing to see except darkness and the occasional flash of distant lightning illuminating massive cloud formations. Emily and the other flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, checking seat belts and stowing loose items. When Emily reached Jessica, she noticed the spilled wine and offered additional napkins. "It's fine," Jessica snapped, embarrassed by her own nervousness. "Just, how long will this last? Is this normal?" Something in her voice must have betrayed her fear because Emily's expression softened slightly. "It's just turbulence, Ms. Harlow. The pilots are well trained for these situations." The plane dropped suddenly, as if the air beneath it had vanished. Jessica's stomach lurched into her throat, and she clutched the armrest so tightly her manicured nails dug into the leather. A few rows ahead, someone let out a muffled sob. "Just turbulence," Jessica muttered sarcastically after Emily had moved on. She tried to focus on her breathing, on maintaining the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting, but each jolt of the aircraft chipped away at her facade. Across the aisle, Meryl had closed her eyes, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't grip the armrests or tense with each drop and shake. Instead, she appeared almost meditative, her breathing deep and regular despite the chaos around her. The plane shook again, more violently this time. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and the cabin lights flickered once, twice before stabilizing. Jessica heard herself make a small, involuntary sound, a whimper she would have been mortified to acknowledge under normal circumstances. Meryl opened her eyes then, looking directly at Jessica. There was no judgment in her gaze, no satisfaction at seeing the woman who had dismissed her now clearly terrified. Instead, her blue eyes held only quiet concern. "Try breathing with me," Meryl said, her voice steady and clear, despite not being raised. "In through your nose for 4 counts, then out through your mouth for 6. Jessica wanted to dismiss the suggestion, to maintain the fiction that she was perfectly fine, but another sharp drop made that impossible. Almost against her will, she found herself watching Meryl demonstrate the breathing pattern, then tentatively following along. In for 4 counts. Hold. Out for 6. "That's it," Meryl encouraged softly. "Turbulence is frightening, but it's rarely dangerous." "Easy for you to say," Jessica managed, her voice brittle. "You're sitting there like you're at a day spa." A small smile touched Meryl's lips. "I've had practice finding calm in storms, both literal and metaphorical." Before Jessica could respond, the plane seemed to drop out of the sky. For one heart-stopping moment, it felt like free fall. Oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling with a simultaneous pop that punctuated the collective gasp of the cabin. Her child somewhere began to cry. The lights flickered again and went out completely, leaving only the dim emergency floor lighting. In that moment of darkness and terror, Jessica felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a child, complete and utter helplessness. All her carefully accumulated status, all her power, all her connections, none of it mattered 30,000 feet above the Atlantic in a metal tube being tossed about by indifferent atmospheric forces. When the backup lighting came on seconds later, casting an eerie glow across frightened faces, Jessica found herself looking to Meryl, not with condescension now, but with desperate hope that the older woman would somehow know what to do, what to say. "We're okay," Meryl said, as if in answer to Jessica's unspoken plea. Her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to extend beyond their shared row. "The plane is designed to handle this. Just keep breathing." Several passengers nearby visibly responded to her words, their panicked breathing slowing slightly. The businessman who had been amused by Jessica's earlier behavior now looked at Meryl with unmistakable gratitude. The captain's voice returned, steady despite the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're working to navigate around the worst of this system. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. The turbulence should ease within the next 15 minutes. 15 minutes. It might as well have been 15 hours. Jessica closed her eyes, trying to focus on Meryl's breathing pattern, but images kept intruding. newspaper headlines about plane crashes, the faces of her parents who had always warned. Her ambition would take her too far from home, clients who would never know what had happened to her. "Tell me something about yourself," Meryl said suddenly, breaking into Jessica's spiraling thoughts. Jessica opened her eyes, startled. "What? Tell me something, anything," Meryl repeated. "About your work, your family, a book you love. It helps to focus the mind elsewhere." The plane continued to shake, but something about Meryl's steady gaze provided an anchor. After a moment's hesitation, Jessica found herself speaking. I was the first person in my family to go to college," she said, surprised by her own admission. It wasn't the polished origin story she usually shared at industry events. "My parents were teachers in a small town. They thought I'd follow them into education." Meryl nodded encouragingly. "But you had different ideas." Another jolt interrupted. "Them?" And Jessica instinctively reached across the aisle. Without hesitation, Meryl extended her hand, clasping Jessica's trembling fingers firmly in her own. "I wanted more," Jessica continued, finding that speaking actually did help distract from the terror. "I wanted to be someone people respected, someone with influence. I moved to New York with 2 suitcases and a stack of rejection letters from every publishing house in the city. And yet here you are," Meryl said, "with your own agency." Jessica gave a weak laugh. "Yes, here I am, terrified in a first-class seat, holding hands with a stranger I insulted." For the first time, Meryl's calm exterior cracked slightly as she chuckled. Life has a way of humbling us all eventually. As if on cue, the turbulence began to ease. The violent shaking gradually subsided to occasional bumps. The cabin lights flickered back to full brightness, and a collective sigh of relief passed through the passengers. The captain announced they had cleared the worst of the weather system. Jessica suddenly became aware that she was still clutching Meryl's hand. She withdrew it quickly, embarrassment flooding her cheeks with color. "Thank you," she said stiffly, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. "I don't usually... that is, I'm normally quite composed." Meryl's eyes crinkled with gentle understanding. "We all need someone to hold on to sometimes, even the most composed among us." As the flight attendants began checking on passengers, Jessica found herself looking at Meryl with new eyes. Who was this woman who remained so steady in chaos? Who offered comfort without condition to someone who had dismissed her so cruelly? The question had barely formed in her mind when the young woman seated near them leaned forward, her face alight with excitement, despite the ordeal they had just endured. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said breathlessly, "but I just have to say, you're Meryl Streep, aren't you?" Jessica's mind went blank, her body frozen as the young woman's words echoed in the now quiet cabin. "You're Meryl Streep, aren't you?" The name hung in the air like a thunderclap after lightning. Meryl Streep. Not some community theater enthusiast. Not some ordinary older woman who didn't belong in first class. Meryl Streep, the most acclaimed actress of her generation, winner of 3 Academy Awards, 21 Oscar nominations, cultural icon, living legend. And Jessica had spent the last hour condescending to her about standards and success. "Yes, I am," Meryl responded to the young woman with a warm smile. "It's nice to meet you." The cabin, still recovering from the turbulence, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Whispers spread rapidly as other passengers realized who had been sitting among them. Several reached for phones to capture discreet photos. The businessman who had been amused earlier now looked at Jessica with something between pity and schadenfreude. "I'm Ella," the young woman continued, seemingly oblivious to Jessica's paralysis. "I'm studying film at NYU. Your work in Sophie's choice is what made me want to become a director. Would it be terribly intrusive to ask for a quick photo when we land?" "Not at all," Meryl replied, her voice just as kind and attentive as it had been while talking Jessica through her panic. "I'd be happy to." Jessica could feel heat climbing her neck, spreading across her cheeks in what she knew must be a visible crimson wave. Her mouth opened, then closed, words utterly failing her. Emily, the flight attendant, approached with fresh napkins for the spilled wine, her expression now holding a hint of satisfaction. "Ms. Streep, is there anything I can get for you?" Emily asked, pointedly ignoring Jessica for the moment. "I'm fine, thank you, Emily," Meryl replied, reading the name tag with the same attentiveness she had shown throughout. "But perhaps some water for Miss Harlow. We've all had quite a scare. Even now, even after Jessica's dismissiveness, her rudeness, her blatant disrespect, Meryl Streep was showing her kindness. It was too much. Jessica wanted to dissolve into her seat, to disappear entirely from this cabin, where everyone now surely knew of her humiliating mistake." "Certainly," Emily replied, the consummate professional once more. "Right away." As Emily moved away, Jessica finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. I had no idea." Meryl turned back to her, those famous blue eyes, eyes that had conveyed every human emotion imaginable on screen, now showing nothing but gentle understanding. "There was no reason you should have. But Jessica struggled to form coherent thoughts, let alone sentences. Her entire identity was built around being the smartest person in the room, the one who recognized opportunity, who knew exactly who mattered. And yet she had failed to recognize one of the most famous women in the world. "I said such terrible things." "About my community theater career?" Meryl's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I've heard worse." A small laugh escaped Jessica, though it sounded almost like a sob to her ears. "I'm so embarrassed." "There's no need to be," Meryl said, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained as private as possible in the increasingly attentive cabin. "Fear makes strangers of us all sometimes." Jessica knew she wasn't just talking about the turbulence, but about the fear that had driven Jessica's entire career, fear of insignificance, fear of being overlooked, fear of being exactly who she had been before. A small-town girl with nothing special to distinguish her. Another passenger approached now, an older woman who apologetically asked Meryl if she would mind signing a napkin. Meryl agreed graciously, engaging the woman in conversation about her grandchildren with genuine interest. Jessica watched, transfixed, as Meryl moved seamlessly from discussing one woman's family to answering another passenger's question about her upcoming projects, never losing the personal connection, never making anyone feel less important than they were. This, Jessica realized with a start, was true power. The ability to make others feel seen, heard, valued. Not the cutting remarks or dismissive glances she had weaponized throughout her career. The revelation was both illuminating and devastating. When Emily returned with water for both of them, Jessica accepted it with uncharacteristic humility. "Thank you," she said, meeting the flight attendant's eyes properly for perhaps the first time. "And I apologize for my behavior earlier." Emily's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, but she nodded. "It's been a difficult flight for everyone." As the cabin settled back into a semblance of normalcy, albeit one now charged with the excitement of celebrity presence, Jessica sipped her water and tried to gather the shattered pieces of her composure. Across the aisle, Meryl had returned to her script, seemingly unbothered by both the turbulence they'd experienced and the minor commotion her identity had caused. "How do you do that?" Jessica asked suddenly. Meryl looked up, eyebrows raised in question. "How do you just exist like this?" Jessica gestured vaguely. "So completely yourself, regardless of who recognizes you or how they treat you." Meryl considered the question with the same thoughtful attention she'd given to everything else. "I suppose I've learned that other people's perceptions rarely have anything to do with who you actually are," she said finally. "They're usually reflections of themselves, their own fears, desires, insecurities." The words landed like gentle arrows, piercing straight through the armor Jessica had spent decades constructing. Wasn't that exactly what she had done? Projected her own insecurities onto this woman who hadn't conformed to her narrow definition of success. "I've been in the public eye for a very long time," Meryl continued. "If I let every opinion, every criticism, every misconception shape who I am, I'd have lost myself years ago." "Lost yourself," Jessica repeated softly. She wondered, not for the first time since the turbulence had shaken her to her core, if she had ever truly found herself to begin with. Or if Jessica Harlow, feared literary agent, was merely a carefully constructed character she had been playing for so long, she'd forgotten it wasn't real. The captain's voice interrupted her thoughts, announcing they were beginning their initial Descent into New York. The news sent a ripple of relief through the cabin. They were almost home, almost safe on solid ground again. But for Jessica, something fundamental had shifted. The ground beneath her feet no longer felt solid at all. The foundations upon which she had built her entire identity, her judgments, her superiority, her carefully calibrated understanding of status and worth, had been revealed as nothing more than sand. She looked at Meryl again, this time really seeing her. Not Meryl Streep, the icon, but the woman who had extended her hand during turbulence, who had guided her breathing, who had listened to her story without judgment, even after Jessica had dismissed her entirely. "I don't know how to apologize properly for how I behaved," Jessica said quietly. "It was inexcusable." Meryl set her script aside. "Would you have acted differently if you'd known who I was from the beginning?" The question caught Jessica off guard. She wanted to lie, to insist, of course. She would have been respectful, but something in Meryl's gaze made dishonesty impossible. "Yes," she admitted, the truth bitter on her tongue. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Meryl nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "We're all just people, Ms. Harlow. Famous or not, rich or poor, accomplished or struggling, all just trying to make our way through the same storms." As the plane began its descent through the clouds, Jessica found herself descending too, past the layers of pretense and performance, down to a place she hadn't visited in years. A place where she was simply herself, stripped of the trappings of status and success, facing the uncomfortable recognition that perhaps she had been the one who didn't belong all along. As the plane continued its descent toward New York, Jessica sat in uncharacteristic silence, the weight of her behavior settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. The cabin around her had transformed. Passengers who had been absorbed in their own worlds before the turbulence now orbited around Meryl's gravitational pull, stealing glances or finding polite excuses to approach her seat. Each interaction, Jessica observed, only deepened her shame. Meryl greeted every person with the same warmth and attention, whether they were gushing fans or simply curious travelers. She signed napkins, listened to stories about how her films had touched lives, and deflected praise with genuine humility. There was no performance to it, no calculated charm, just authentic human connection. Jessica had spent her entire career in publishing, an industry built on storytelling, yet she had somehow missed the most important story, that people were more than their appearances, their titles or their bank accounts. That true worth couldn't be assessed at a glance, or measured by outward symbols of success. She reached for her water glass with trembling fingers, accidentally knocking it over. Water spilled across her tray table, dripping onto her expensive slacks. 6 hours ago this would have sent her into a cold fury. Now she barely noticed. "Here," Meryl said, offering her own cocktail napkin. "It's clean." Jessica accepted it wordlessly, dabbing at the spreading dampness. "Thank you," she managed finally, the words feeling entirely inadequate. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Meryl observed quietly, her voice pitched to create a small island of privacy amid the cabin's excited buzz. "Just the weight of my own foolishness," Jessica replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I keep replaying everything I said to you, and each time it sounds worse." Meryl tilted her head slightly. "We all make mistakes in judgment." "This wasn't a mistake," Jessica said, surprising herself with her honesty. "It was who I am, or who I've become." She folded the damp napkin carefully, needing something to do with her hands. "I've spent my entire career sizing people, up deciding who matters and who doesn't, based on the most superficial criteria imaginable. And it served you well professionally," Meryl noted without judgment. Jessica considered this. Had it? She had the corner office, the roster of best-selling clients, the reputation that made assistants tremble. But she also had an empty apartment. She rarely spent time in colleagues who feared rather than respected her, and not a single person she could truly call a friend. "I'm not sure anymore," she admitted softly. A flight attendant approached, not Emily this time, but a young man whose name tag read Michael. He addressed Meryl with barely contained excitement. "Ms. Streep, the captain asked me to extend his Personal welcome aboard. He's a huge fan and wondered if you might be willing to visit the cockpit briefly after we land. Of course, Meryl agreed. That would be lovely. As Michael moved away, she turned back to Jessica. Where were we? Jessica shook her head in wonder. How do you do that? Remain so present for everyone. Don't you get tired of it? Sometimes, Meryl admitted with a small shrug. But I learned long ago that these small moments matter. For that young man, this is a story he'll tell for years. It costs me nothing to be kind, but it might mean everything to him. It costs me nothing to be kind. The simplicity of the statement struck Jessica like a physical blow. When had kindness become something she discarded as inefficient, unnecessary? When had she decided that her time, her attention, her basic humanity were commodities too precious to waste on those she deemed unimportant? The vast distance between the person she had become and the person she had once hoped to be suddenly yawned before her like an unbridgeable chasm. I wasn't always like this, she said, more to herself than to Meryl. When I first moved to New York, I was determined to succeed, but not to lose myself in the process. She gave a hollow laugh. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that being feared was better than being forgettable. Meryl's eyes, so famously expressive on screen, now held a depth of understanding that made Jessica feel both seen and exposed. The publishing world can be brutal, Jessica continued, the words spilling out now. As a woman, doubly so. I thought I needed armor, weapons. I thought I had to become the thing I feared most. And what was that? Meryl asked gently. Jessica swallowed hard. Invisible, insignificant. She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her blouse. I grew up in a town where no one ever left, where dreams stayed small and manageable. I was terrified of disappearing into that sameness. A single tear escaped, tracking a path down her cheek that she quickly wiped away. So, I built this persona, this untouchable, ruthless woman who would never be overlooked. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. And somewhere along the way, I started believing she was real. She is real, Meryl said, surprising Jessica. She's a part of you, a part that protected you, that helped you survive in a world that can be unforgiving to ambitious women. The mistake isn't in having created her, but in letting her be the only part that gets to exist. The plane banked, slightly, the sprawling lights of New York now visible through the windows. Home, or the place where she lived at least. Jessica couldn't remember the last time anywhere had truly felt like home. You know what terrifies me most? She asked, no longer caring how vulnerable she appeared. The thought that if I let go of this armor, there might be nothing underneath. That I've spent so long being Jessica Harlow, cutthroat agent, that Jessica Harlow, human being, doesn't exist anymore. Meryl's expression softened. She's still there. She reached for my hand during the turbulence, remember? She apologized to Emily. She's the one talking to me now. The captain's voice interrupted, announcing their final approach to JFK International Airport. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking that seats and tray tables were in their upright positions. As the vast city grew larger beneath them, Jessica felt something shift inside her, something fundamental and possibly irreversible. She had boarded this flight as a woman convinced of her own importance, secure in her judgments, certain of her place in the world. She would disembark as someone else entirely, someone humbled, uncertain, but perhaps, finally, real. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and applause broke out among the passengers, relief at having safely arrived, at having survived both the literal turbulence and the unexpected presence of greatness among them. Beside her, Meryl joined in the applause, her smile genuine. New beginnings, she said, almost too quietly for Jessica to hear above the noise. Jessica didn't clap. Instead, she sat perfectly still, feeling the weight of regret slowly giving way to something else, something that felt strangely like possibility. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around them, passengers rose in a choreographed rush, reaching for overhead compartments and forming the inevitable queue in the aisle. Jessica remained seated, suddenly in no hurry to return to her meticulously scheduled life. "I should let you go," she said to Meryl, gesturing to the small crowd that had gathered a respectful distance away, clearly waiting for their chance to speak with the actress. "You have admirers waiting." Meryl glanced at the gathering and then back to Jessica. "They can wait a moment longer." She leaned slightly closer. "You know, I wasn't always comfortable with myself either." Jessica raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You? Meryl Streep? The woman with more Oscar nominations than anyone in history?" A soft laugh escaped Meryl's lips. "Long before all that. When I first started acting professionally, I was convinced I wasn't beautiful enough. My nose was wrong. My cheekbones weren't prominent enough." She shook her head at the memory. "I actually got rejected for King Kong because the producer thought I wasn't attractive enough for the role." "That's insane," Jessica blurted before she could stop herself. "In retrospect, yes," Meryl agreed with a wry smile, "but at the time it was devastating. I believed my worth was tied to my appearance, to fitting some arbitrary standard." She gestured subtly toward the first-class cabin. "We all create these standards, these measuring sticks for value. They rarely lead to happiness." Jessica absorbed this, trying to reconcile the self-assured woman before her with the young actress who had faced such brutal rejection. "How did you move past it?" "Slowly. Imperfectly." Meryl's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I realized that the roles that fulfilled me most were the ones where I disappeared into someone else's truth, not where I conformed to Hollywood's idea of beauty or success." The plane had nearly emptied now, with only a few passengers lingering, including the small group still hoping to speak with Meryl. Emily appeared at the edge of their row. "Miss Streep, the captain is ready to welcome you to the cockpit whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Emily. Just another minute or two," Meryl replied, before turning back to Jessica. "The point is, we all wear masks. The question is whether they're serving us or trapping us." Jessica thought about her own carefully constructed mask. The sharp suits, the cutting remarks, the calculated intimidation. Had it served her, protected her in a cutthroat industry? Or had it trapped her in a persona that left no room for growth, for connection, for authenticity? "I don't know if I even remember who I am without mine," she admitted. "Then perhaps it's time to find out." Meryl reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, handing it to Jessica. "This is my assistant's contact information. If you ever want to continue this conversation, reach out." Jessica accepted the card with trembling fingers, stunned by the unexpected gesture. "Why would you do this, after how I treated you?" Meryl stood, gathering her modest belongings. "Because 30,000 feet above the ground, with the world falling away beneath us, you showed me who you really are, not who you pretend to be." She smiled, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "And that person is worth knowing." With that, she moved into the aisle, immediately surrounded by the waiting passengers. Jessica watched as Meryl transitioned seamlessly into graciously accepting compliments and signing impromptu autographs. Yet even amid the attention, she caught Meryl glancing back once, her eyes meeting Jessica's in a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Left alone in her seat, Jessica turned the business card over in her hands. Such a small thing, this rectangle of heavy cardstock, yet it felt like both a lifeline and a challenge. She slipped it into her wallet before finally rising to collect her belongings. As she walked through the emptying plane toward the exit, Emily gave her a professional nod. "Have a good evening, Miss Harlow." Something made Jessica pause. "Emily, I want to apologize again for my behavior earlier. It was unacceptable." Surprise flickered across the flight attendant's face. "Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm trying to be—" Jessica hesitated, searching for the right words. "More mindful of how I affect others." A small, genuine smile touched Emily's lips. "That's a rare quality these days." Jessica stepped off the plane and into the jetway, the familiar rush of conditioned air washing over her. Normally at this point, she would already be on her phone, checking emails, reasserting control over her domain. Instead, she found herself walking slowly, her mind replaying fragments of her conversation with Meryl. We all create these standards, these measuring sticks for value. They rarely lead to happiness. How many authors had she dismissed because They didn't have the right look, the right background, the right connections. How many potential relationships, professional and personal, had she sabotaged because the other person didn't meet her arbitrary criteria for worthiness? The terminal bustled with the usual chaos of an international arrival. Reunions, business people striding purposefully toward exits, confused tourists consulting maps. Jessica navigated through it all as if in a dream, hyper-aware of each interaction. Around her, the gentle way a grandfather lifted a toddler into his arms, the patience of a customer service agent dealing with a frustrated traveler, the quiet dignity of a cleaner going about his work unnoticed by hurrying passengers. Had these small moments of humanity always been happening around her, or had she been too wrapped up in her own importance to notice? Jessica's phone vibrated in her pocket, her assistant no doubt confirming her car service. She ignored it. For once in her meticulously managed life, the urgent emails and messages could wait. Instead, she found herself drawn to a small airport cafe with a view of the runways. She ordered a coffee, not her usual precise specification of a triple-shot non-fat extra-hot latte, but just a simple black coffee, and took a seat by the window. Outside, planes took off and landed in their carefully coordinated dance, each carrying hundreds of lives, hundreds of stories. Strangers thrown together for hours at a time, breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same confined space, much like she and Meryl had been. But while most passengers remained strangers throughout their journey, something extraordinary had happened between her and Meryl. In the span of a single flight, a mirror had been held up to Jessica's carefully constructed life, reflecting back a truth she could no longer ignore. She pulled out Meryl's card again, running her finger over the embossed lettering. The old Jessica Harlow would have immediately added this contact to her network, leveraging it for professional gain. The woman sitting here now wasn't sure what she would do with it, only that whatever came next would be different. She sipped her coffee, watching as the lights of another plane lifted into the darkening sky, carrying with it more lives, more stories, more possibilities for unexpected connection. Jessica's coffee had grown cold, the terminal crowds thinned as evening deepened. Her phone had vibrated persistently until she finally silenced it, something she'd never done before. 3 hours had passed since landing. 3 hours she'd spent sitting in an airport cafe, rather than rushing back to her carefully ordered life. "Ma'am, we're closing in 15 minutes. Jessica looked up to find a young barista with tired eyes watching her expectantly. "Oh, of course. Thank you." She gathered her belongings, surprised to realize she'd been lost in thought for so long. The barista moved to wipe down a nearby table, and Jessica noticed the young woman's name tag. Sophia. "Sophia," Jessica said, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. When was the last time she'd addressed service staff by name? "Thank you for letting me sit here so long." The young woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, her automatic customer service smile warming into something more genuine. "No problem. You looked like you needed the space." Did she? Jessica wondered what this stranger had seen in her, what anyone saw when they looked at her. The fearsome literary agent? The shallow woman who had judged Meryl Streep by her clothing? Or something else entirely? Outside the terminal, the night air carried the distinctive blend of jet fuel exhaust and the promise of the city beyond. Jessica's driver had long since given up and left, another unprecedented development in her rigidly scheduled existence. She joined the taxi queue, feeling strangely liberated by the mundanity of it. When her turn came, she slid into the back seat of a yellow cab, giving her address to the driver automatically. As they pulled away from the curb, her gaze caught on a familiar figure exiting through the terminal doors. Meryl, flanked by what appeared to be a personal assistant, walking with the same unassuming grace she'd shown on the plane. Jessica watched, until Meryl disappeared from view, taking with her the strange spell of the last several hours. Reality began to seep back in. Tomorrow, Jessica would need to return to her office, to her clients, to the world she had built with such single-minded determination. Could she simply step back into that life as if nothing had changed? The taxi merged onto the expressway, the familiar Manhattan skyline coming into view, a glittering testament to ambition, to the human desire to reach ever higher. Jessica had always looked at those buildings and seen proof that anything was Possible if you wanted it badly enough. Now she found herself wondering about the cost of such ambition. First time in New York? The driver asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. Jessica almost laughed. No, I've lived here for 18 years. Ah, the driver nodded. You were looking at the skyline like you'd never seen it before. The observation startled her. I suppose I am seeing it differently tonight. The driver, an older man with salt and pepper, hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners, not unlike Meryl's, Jessica realized, nodded knowingly. That happens sometimes. The city stays the same, but we change. The simple wisdom in his words resonated with her. Have you lived here long? She found herself asking, another departure from her usual disinterest in small talk with service. Providers. 42 years, he replied, pride evident in his voice. Came from Haiti with nothing but hope and a strong back. Jessica leaned forward slightly. And was it worth it, coming here? He considered the question seriously, as if sensing it carried weight beyond casual conversation. Yes and no. I built a good life, put 3 children through college. A shadow crossed his face. But I missed my mother's final years. Couldn't go back for my father's funeral. Time is the price we pay for dreams, you know. Time, the currency Jessica had spent so recklessly, convinced there would always be more. Time she'd poured into building a reputation rather than relationships. Time focused on climbing higher rather than living deeper. I'm not sure my dreams were the right ones, she admitted, surprising herself with the confession to a stranger. The driver chuckled softly. The beautiful thing about dreams is that you can always have new ones. They lapsed into comfortable silence as the taxi crossed the bridge into Manhattan. Jessica watched the city unfold before her, the same streets she'd walked for nearly 2 decades, yet somehow transformed by her shifted perspective. When they arrived at her building, a sleek high-rise in Tribeca with a uniformed doorman and marble lobby, Jessica tipped the driver generously. Thank you for the conversation, she said, meaning it. Thank you for listening, he replied, his smile genuine. Not everyone does. The doorman greeted her by name as she entered, but his usual deference was tinged with confusion. She was ours. Later than her normal schedule, arriving by taxi rather than her usual car service. Small disruptions in a precisely calibrated routine. Her apartment on the 38th floor was exactly as she'd left it, immaculately designed, impeccably maintained, and utterly impersonal. Art chosen for investment value rather than emotional. Resonance hung on walls painted the perfect shade of gallery white. Furniture selected by her decorator sat pristinely untouched. It was a showpiece, not a home. Jessica moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city lights that had always made her feel like she'd arrived, like she belonged among the elite. Tonight, they just made her feel alone. Her phone, forgotten in her pocket, vibrated again. She pulled it out to find 17 missed calls, 29 text messages, and 42 emails, her absence apparently constituting a minor crisis in her meticulously managed world. The most recent text was from her assistant, getting worried. Please confirm you're alive or I'm calling hospitals. Jessica sighed and responded, I'm fine, home now, taking the night off. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, taking the night off. Are you sure? You're okay. The question landed with unexpected weight. Was she okay? Jessica wasn't sure anymore. The foundations upon which she'd built her entire adult life had been shaken by a chance encounter, by turbulence both literal and metaphorical, by the gentle wisdom of a woman who had achieved far more than Jessica ever would, but carried it with a grace she couldn't fathom. I don't know, she typed honestly, then deleted it. Yes, she wrote instead. Just need some time to think. I'll be in late tomorrow. She set the phone down and kicked off her heels, padding barefoot to the kitchen, where she opened a cabinet filled with expensive wine she rarely had time to enjoy. She selected a bottle at random, uncorked it and poured a generous glass. Standing in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of success that had always seemed like enough before, Jessica raised her glass in a silent toast to the sky. To the plane that had brought her home, to the woman who had held up a mirror to her soul. The descent had begun. Where she would land remained to be seen, Jessica woke to sunlight streaming through windows, whose blinds she'd forgotten to close. Another break in routine. For a moment she lay still, the events of the previous day washing over her. Had it really happened? Had she really spent hours on a plane beside Meryl Streep, exposed her deepest insecurities, and then upended her carefully scheduled life to sit in an airport cafe contemplating existence? The business card on her nightstand confirmed it hadn't been a dream. She reached for it, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. A connection to another world, a world where people valued authenticity over appearance, kindness over power. Her phone showed the time. 9:17 a.m. On any normal day, she would have been at her desk for nearly 3 hours already, terrorizing assistants and evaluating manuscripts with her particular brand of brutal efficiency. Today, she couldn't summon the energy to care about being late. In the shower, Jessica found herself replaying fragments of conversation with Meryl. It costs me nothing to be kind, but it might mean everything to him. Such a simple principle, yet one she had abandoned long ago in her climb to the top. What might her life look like if she applied it now? She dressed with unusual care, selecting a deep blue suit that she'd once been told brought out her eyes, rather than her standard power black. Her hair, normally pulled back in a severe style that projected authority, she left loose around her shoulders. Small changes, but they felt significant. Outside her building, instead of calling her car service, Jessica decided to walk the 20 blocks to her office. The spring morning was clear and cool, the city humming with its particular energy. She found herself noticing details that usually blurred past her hurried stride: a community garden tucked between buildings, an elderly couple holding hands on a bench, a street musician whose violin sang with surprising sweetness. At a corner cafe, she impulsively stopped for coffee and a pastry, something she normally would have delegated to an assistant. The barista, a young man with vibrant tattoos peeking from beneath his sleeves, smiled genuinely as he handed over her order. "Have a beautiful day," he said. "You too," Jessica replied, the words feeling foreign but not unpleasant on her tongue. Walking the final blocks to her office building, Jessica found herself wondering what her colleagues would make of her transformation. Would they notice the subtle changes in her appearance, her demeanor? Or would they be too caught up in their own carefully constructed performances to see? The elevator doors opened onto the 32nd floor, where Harlow Literary Management was etched in imposing letters on the wall. Her assistant, Zach, nearly dropped his coffee when he saw her stroll in 3 hours late. "Jessica, I was just about to call again. I was worried." "Good morning, Zach," she said, cutting off his panicked babbling with unexpected gentleness. "I'm fine. Just needed some extra time this morning." The young man blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process this departure from the boss, who routinely demanded perfection and punctuality from everyone around her. "Oh, okay. You have the editorial meeting at 10, and Craig Whitfield has called 3 times about his contract negotiation, and—" "The meeting can wait 15 minutes, Jessica said, taking her coffee and pastry bag. "Tell everyone I'll be there at 10:15, and let Craig know I'll call him personally before noon." Zach's mouth opened and closed, fish-like. "Sure, yes, of course." As Jessica moved toward her office, she paused and turned back. "Zach, how long have you been my assistant?" "Now?" He straightened reflexively. 7 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. The precision of his answer, clearly born from anxiety, struck Jessica with unexpected force. What kind of environment had she created where her employees counted each day of survival? "And I've never asked, do you enjoy working here?" Zach froze, clearly suspecting some kind of trap. I've learned a lot," he managed diplomatically. Jessica nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked. But thank you for your honesty." She hesitated, then added, "I'd like to have a proper conversation soon about your career goals and how I can better support them. Maybe tomorrow morning. Over real coffee, not the sludge from the break room." The look of utter confusion on Zach's face would have been comical if it hadn't been so damning. "That would be great," he said cautiously. Jessica's corner office offered sweeping views of the city, its walls adorned with framed New York Times bestseller lists featuring her clients' work. Normally, these displays of achievement filled her with fierce pride. Today, they seemed like artifacts from another. Life? She set down her coffee and opened her laptop, scanning through the mountain of emails that had accumulated, publishing emergencies that suddenly seemed less urgent, author anxieties that required reassurance rather than dismissal, opportunities for books that might sell well but said nothing meaningful. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Melody Chen, one of her junior agents and the only staff member who didn't seem terrified of her, stood in the doorway. The Morrow acquisition fell through, Melody said without preamble. They went with Diane at ICM. 6 months of work, a potential 7-figure deal gone. Yesterday, this news would have triggered a legendary explosion of rage. Today, Jessica felt only a distant disappointment. Did the author say why? She asked. Melody shifted uncomfortably. She said Diane made her feel valued as a writer, not just as a commodity. She hesitated before adding, she mentioned that you never remembered her children's names, even though her book is about motherhood. The words landed like a physical blow. Jessica sank into her chair, suddenly seeing herself through the author's eyes, calculating, cold, focused on dollar signs rather than the human being creating the art. Thank you for telling me, Jessica said quietly. And Melody, you did good work on that submission. The failure was mine, not yours. Melody's expression shifted from braced for impact to utter shock. Thank you? After Melody left, Jessica swiveled her chair to face the window, gazing out at the city that had both shaped and hardened her. For 15 years, she had operated by a simple principle. Value was determined by utility, by what someone could do for her career, her agency, her bank account. But what had that approach cost her? Genuine connections, authentic relationships, the chance to truly appreciate the art her authors created, rather than just its market potential. Jessica pulled out Meryl's card again, turning it over in her fingers. The meeting, she was already late for, awaited her, filled with people who expected the old Jessica Harlow, sharp-tongued, demanding, intimidating. Could she simply walk in as this new, uncertain version of herself? Would they respect her less? Would her business suffer? Or would something new and unexpected flourish in the space created by letting go of the armor she'd worn for so long? She slipped the card back into her pocket, stood, straightened her blue suit and headed toward the conference room, stepping with each stride closer to a reality she was only beginning to imagine. A week passed, then 2. Small changes accumulated in Jessica's life like snowflakes, individually insignificant, but collectively transforming the landscape of her existence. She learned Zach had literary ambitions of his own, a novel half-completed that he'd never dared mention to her. She arranged for him to meet with Melody for mentorship. She remembered the names of her author's children. She stopped scheduling calls during dinner hours. She began asking why, instead of simply demanding what and when, the E. Office atmosphere shifted subtly. Where silence once fell when she entered a room, conversations now continued. The rigid hierarchy remained. She was still the founder and president, but fear no longer served as the primary motivator. Some staff members adapted quickly to the change, while others remained wary, convinced this was some elaborate test they might fail. On this particular Tuesday morning, Jessica sat at her desk, reviewing a manuscript that 2 years ago she would have rejected for being too literary, too risky. Now she found herself drawn to its authentic voice, its willingness to explore uncomfortable truths. She made notes, in the margins, not about marketability or commercial viability, but about moments that moved her, questions that lingered. Jessica? Zach stood in her doorway, more relaxed than he would have been 3 weeks ago, but still professional. There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment. Jessica looked up, mildly curious. Who is it? She says her name is Catherine Baker. She's Ms. Streep's assistant. The manuscript slipped from Jessica's fingers. Meryl's assistant. Here, in her office. Send her in, please. Catherine Baker was a poised woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations with discretion. Miss Harlow, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for seeing me without notice. Jessica rose to greet her, suddenly conscious of every detail of her office, the imposing desk, the wall of achievements, the deliberate signals of power and status. How differently she saw them now, through the lens of her evolving perspective. Of course, please sit down. Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Water? Catherine settled into the visitor's chair with easy grace. No, thank you. I won't take much. Of your time. She reached into her bag and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. Mrs. Streep asked me to deliver this personally. Jessica accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. She could have called or emailed. She preferred this approach, Catherine replied with a small smile that suggested there were reasons beyond convenience. The envelope contained a single card, handwritten in elegant script. Jessica, I'm hosting a small gathering at my home this Friday evening. A reading of a new play by a promising young playwright. Nothing fancy, just good words and good company. I'd be pleased if you could join us. Sometimes the most important journeys continue long after the plane has landed. Meryl, an address and time followed, along with a note to RSVP to Catherine. Jessica read the invitation twice, then looked up to find Catherine watching her with quiet assessment. I'd be honored to attend, Jessica said, finally. Catherine nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. Excellent. It's a small group, mostly theatre people, a few writers, casual dress. She rose to leave, then paused. Ms. Streep mentioned, your conversation was quite meaningful to her. The statement hung in the air, an unexpected gift. Jessica had assumed the impact had been one-sided, that she alone had been transformed by their encounter. It changed everything for me, Jessica admitted. Catherine's professional demeanor softened almost imperceptibly. She has that effect on people. She moved toward the door, then turned back with a knowing look. The playwright whose work we're reading, she's unpublished but extraordinarily talented. Just the sort of voice that might benefit from a literary agent with vision. With that, she was gone, leaving Jessica holding the invitation and a new possibility she hadn't anticipated. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings, manuscripts, and moments of self-reflection. Jessica found herself unusually nervous about Friday evening, not because she would be in Meryl Streep's home, but because she would be meeting the woman again as her evolving self, still uncertain, still in progress. When Friday arrived, Jessica spent an uncharacteristic amount of time deciding what to wear. Her closet was filled with power suits, designer dresses chosen to intimidate rather than connect. In the back, she found a simple blue dress she'd purchased years ago for a college friend's wedding, before she'd fully transformed into the Jessica Harlow who valued status above all else. The address led her to a brownstone in the West Village, elegant but understated. Jessica stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, gathering her courage. 3 weeks ago, she would have approached this evening as a networking opportunity, a chance to collect another valuable contact. Now she wasn't sure what it was, only that it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with professional advancement. A young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile answered the door. You must be Jessica. I'm Emily, the playwright. She extended her hand with an openness that suggested she hadn't yet learned to armor herself against the world's judgment. It's wonderful to meet you, Jessica said, meaning it. The gathering was indeed small, perhaps 20 people scattered throughout the gracious living room, engaged in animated conversations that fell just short of the networking Jessica was accustomed to in publishing circles. This was different. People connecting over ideas rather than opportunities, passion rather than potential. Meryl spotted her from across the room and made her way over, wearing a simple black outfit that would have been unremarkable on anyone else but somehow radiated elegance on her. You came, she said, her smile genuine. Thank you for inviting me, Jessica replied, suddenly shy. Your assistant mentioned the playwright is unpublished. Meryl's eyes crinkled with amusement. Catherine has excellent instincts about people. She thought you might appreciate Emily's voice. I'd love to hear more about her work, Jessica said, then hesitated, but not as an agent tonight, just as someone who loves good stories. Something like approval flickered in Meryl's eyes. The reading will start soon. Come, let me introduce you to some friends first. As Meryl led her through the room, making thoughtful introductions that went beyond titles or accomplishments, Jessica felt a curious sensation, as if she were standing in a terminal between two possible lives. Behind her lay the path she had traveled for so long, paved with ambition and armored against vulnerability. Ahead, a different way opened, less certain but somehow more alive, when they all settled to hear Emily read from her play, a powerful exploration of family secrets and forgiveness. Jessica found herself fully present in a way she rarely experienced, not calculating market potential or comparable titles, but simply absorbing the words, allowing them to resonate. Glancing around the room, she saw the same attentive presence on every face, perhaps most notably on Meryl's, whose deep listening seemed to elevate both the words and the young woman reading them. In that moment, Jessica realized she was witnessing something she had forgotten existed: art appreciated for its intrinsic value rather than its commercial potential. Talent nurtured not for what it might produce, but for what it already was. The terminal she stood in suddenly felt less like a way station and more like a destination of its own, a place of transformation where the journey and arrival merged into something new altogether. 3 months after that fateful flight, Jessica stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, watching summer rain trace patterns down the glass. The view remained the same, Manhattan's iconic skyline undaunted by the weather, but the woman observing it had changed profoundly. On her desk sat a manuscript, Emily's play, transformed into a novel of remarkable depth and humanity. Jessica had spent weeks working with the young playwright, guiding her through the adaptation process, not as a demanding gatekeeper, but as a thoughtful partner. Today, she would be sending it to publishers, not with her usual aggressive tactics, but with genuine conviction in the work's merit. Her phone chimed with a text from Zach. "Harper's editor-in-chief is on line 1 whenever you're ready." Jessica smiled at the phrasing, "whenever you're ready." A small but telling shift from the frantic urgency that once characterized all communication in her office. She had learned that few things in publishing were truly emergencies, that making space for reflection often led to better decisions. She picked up the phone. "Jessica Harlow." "Jessica, it's Eleanor. I've just finished the manuscript you sent. Over last week, the memoir by the refugee aid worker. It's extraordinary." Jessica felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. The memoir had been a risk, powerful but not obviously commercial, exactly the kind of project she would have dismissed 3 months ago as unmarketable despite its merit. "I thought you might connect with it," Jessica replied. "The author has such an authentic voice. We want to make a preemptive offer. It's not the biggest check we've written this year, but we'll put our full support behind it. This is a book that matters." After finalizing details with Eleanor, Jessica made the call she'd been looking forward to all day, telling a first-time author whose work deserved recognition that her book had found the perfect home. Once, she would have calculated the commission before making such a call. Today, she thought only of the author's journey and the readers whose lives might be changed by her words. A knock at her door pulled her attention away as she ended the call. Melody stood in the doorway, a hint of nervousness still visible despite their improved relationship. "The staff meeting is starting," she said. "Everyone's waiting in the conference room." Jessica nodded, gathering a few notes. "Thanks, Melody. By the way, Harper made an offer on Samira's memoir. We were right about it." Melody's face lit up. "That's fantastic. I knew Eleanor would get it." "Your editorial notes made all the difference," Jessica acknowledged, remembering how once she would have claimed all credit for such successes. In the conference room, Jessica surveyed the faces around the table. Some new, some familiar, all part of a culture she was consciously reshaping. 3 months had brought significant changes to Harlow Literary Management. 2 agents who had thrived under the old cutthroat environment had left. Their departures had created space for new voices, including Zach, recently promoted to junior, agent with his own small but growing client list. "Before we discuss our submission strategy for fall," Jessica began, "I want to share some news. We've been invited to partner with the Lila Wallace Foundation on a mentorship program for underrepresented voices in literature." She smiled, remembering the conversation with Meryl that had led to this opportunity. It's a chance to discover writers who might never find their way through traditional channels. The announcement generated genuine enthusiasm around the table. Jessica had worried that her evolving approach would damage the agency's reputation for results, but something unexpected had happened instead. As she softened her tactics, the agency had begun attracting different clients, authors seeking partners in their creative journey rather than just aggressive negotiators. Revenue had dipped slightly during the transition, but signs pointed to a more sustainable future. More importantly, Jessica no longer measured success solely by numbers on a balance sheet. After the meeting dispersed, Jessica returned to her office to find an elegant ivory envelope on her desk, another invitation from Meryl, this time to a charity gala supporting arts education in underserved communities. Their occasional meetings had evolved into a genuine friendship, one that continually challenged Jessica to examine her assumptions about success and meaning. A text message interrupted her thoughts. Jessica smiled when she saw it was from her mother, with whom she had reconnected after years of perfunctory holiday calls. She had flown home to Connecticut last month, her first visit in nearly 3 years, and spent a weekend rediscovering the parents she had once been so desperate to leave behind. They had welcomed her without judgment, as if understanding that the daughter who returned was more authentic than the one who had been holding them at arm's length for years. Outside her window, the rain had stopped, sunlight breaking through, clouds to illuminate the city with sudden brilliance. Jessica gathered her things, deciding to leave early for a change. The manuscript she had been editing could wait until tomorrow. "I'm heading out," she told Zach as she passed his desk. "The Harper contract came through for Samira, so we can celebrate properly tomorrow." "With the good champagne?" Zach asked, with a grin that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "Absolutely, it's worth celebrating properly." Outside the building, Jessica opted to walk rather than call a car, enjoying the freshness of the air after the rain. 3 blocks from her office, she passed a small independent bookstore she must have walked by hundreds of times without noticing. On impulse, she stepped inside. The owner, a woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, looked up from her desk. "Anything I can help you find?" "Just browsing," Jessica replied, inhaling the particular scent of books and possibility that had first drawn her to publishing years ago, before ambition had narrowed her vision. She wandered through the shelves, eventually selecting a novel by an author she represented, not one of her bestsellers, but a quiet, beautifully written book she truly believed in. At the register, she handed it to the owner. "Excellent choice," the woman said. "This one doesn't get the attention it deserves." "The author's working on something new," Jessica found herself saying. "Something even better." "I'll look forward to it." The owner wrapped the book carefully. "Are you in publishing? You have that look." Jessica smiled. "I'm a literary agent." "Ah," the woman nodded knowingly. "Bringing stories into the world. Important work, that." Jessica accepted the wrapped book, struck by the simple truth of the statement. Important work, not because of the money it generated or the status it conferred, but because stories themselves mattered. How had she forgotten that fundamental truth? Outside again, Jessica paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the slice of sky visible between buildings. Somewhere above, planes traced invisible paths across the heavens, carrying people to destinations unknown. Perhaps at this very moment, someone else was experiencing their own moment of reckoning, their own unexpected encounter that would alter the course of their life. Jessica tucked the book into her bag and continued walking, no longer the woman who had boarded that flight 3 months ago. Each step carried her further into a future she was still discovering, one where success was measured, not by what she accumulated, but by what she contributed, not by who feared her, but by who she helped to flourish. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Old habits sometimes reasserted themselves. The ambition that had driven her for so long remained, though now channeled toward different ends. But with each choice, each interaction, each day lived with greater awareness, Jessica Harlow continued to write the newest and perhaps most meaningful chapter of her life, a life that had been forever changed by a chance encounter at 30,000 feet with a woman who had shown her that true power lay not in being feared, but in being authentically, unapologetically, magnificently human.